The Viceland documentary on the mysterious death of GINO HERNANDEZ aired this week. I watched this a few weeks ago and really enjoyed it. GINO was a huge star in world-class championship wrestling in the early and mid-'80s and was only 28 years old when he died in 1986. And he is one of the great what-if stories in wrestling. What if he did not die so young? Would he have gone on to work for Vince McMahon? Would he have gone on to work for WCW? Could he have been a world champion? We'll never know. But when Jose Lothario died, I mentioned the fact that he was GINO's trainer. The same man who trained Shawn Michaels also trained GINO HERNANDEZ. And back then, you had men like Randy Savage and Roddy Piper, who were not physically the biggest guys on the roster, but they could talk, and they had charisma, and so did GINO. So even in the land of the monsters back then, I think he would have had a good shot at success in WWE. And for sure, I think he would have had success in the NWA. I mean, I've heard people say that they could have seen GINO as a horseman. Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially given some of the people who ended up becoming horsemen. I think you could have done a lot better with GINO HERNANDEZ as a member of the Four Horsemen. All due respect to Paul Roma, or even Lex Luger. So yeah, I absolutely, could see that. But he was his own worst enemy. He had a bad drug habit. He was his own worst enemy. It's kind of like the Kerry Von Erich situation. Kerry Von Erich was a very talented guy, and he was super popular, and the women were into him, and he, the sky could have been the limit for Kerry Von Erich. But he just wasn't all there. And he had major drug issues, and it's what led to his downfall. Drugs, man. Telling you, in the 1980s, drugs, cocaine. That was the issue for a lot of people back then. Which leads to the question of, what did he die of? Because a lot of people, a lot of wrestlers, even some of his own family members for years believed that GINO was murdered. And I believe Michael Hayes might have said that before, Jake Roberts and people like that. And I think even after you watch this special, whichever side of the fence that you find yourself on, this probably did not do much to change your mind. So if you already had an opinion about this going in, I mean, some minds may have changed. People who bought into certain conspiracy theories maybe now see that maybe it wasn't. But I don't know that it's going to strongly change anyone's opinion if they had a strong one, before they watch this. But they interviewed a whole bunch of people. David Manning, who was also all over the World Class special on the Von Erichs, because he was a referee and a booker for World Class for a number of years. David Manning is featured in this. Bruce Pritchard, who got his start working in that Houston territory and for Paul Bosch back in the day. So he's interviewed for this as well. Jake Roberts, who worked with GINO and partied with GINO by his own admission. Jeannie Clark, who is the ex-wife of Chris Adams, the late Chris Adams, and the ex-wife of Stone Cold Steve Austin. She was the one who, as the story is told, Austin was really bummed about what was going on with, his push in WWE when he first came in and the whole ringmaster gimmick, and she had made tea and said, don't let your tea become stone cold. I mean, you've heard that story before. So she's interviewed in this as well because she was married to Chris at the time. Chris was tag team partners and good friends with GINO. And in fact, I think she had maybe moved into a house next to GINO, was like a neighbor of his. So it made sense that they would get some comments from her. Since Chris is not alive anymore, they couldn't interview him for this. And they also interviewed, GINO's ex-wife, his daughter, and GINO's mother, Patrice, who is the real star of this special. GINO, the basic story here is that as talented as he was, and he was, on a personal level, behind the scenes, off camera, GINO ran with the wrong crowd. Everybody, almost to a T, said the same thing. He hung with the wrong crowd. His ex-wife left him in part because she did not feel safe, given the kind of people that he was associating himself with. His mother said that the last time she saw him, he seemed very nervous, like he felt something might happen to him, he might be in some kind of danger. He was afraid of someone or something. It was Super Bowl Sunday in '86. That was the last time she saw him alive. He thought that people were following him. He told this wild story about being in his car and looking in the rearview mirror, and he saw somebody sitting in the back seat, kind of pop up, and they were sitting in the back seat of his car. And he didn't know if they were there to kill him or what they were there for. And was there actually somebody in the back seat of his car trying to get him? I don't know. I mean, who knows, right? Who could say for sure? But he told people that that's what happened, and he sure seemed to think so. You know, David Manning said that Gino missed a show one night in Oklahoma. He didn't think anything of it, but then he missed a show in Houston. And that is when he knew that something was up. His business manager was looking for him. His business manager called his mother and said, look, we haven't heard from him in a few days. Have you heard from Gino? She said, no, but, it's my birthday and he'll call. So I'm sure, if you don't hear from him first, I will. And of course, Gino never called. So what Manning ended up doing, David Manning sent one of the other world-class referees over to Gino's house. And when he jumped over the wall in the back and he peeked through the window, he saw Gino's body. I mean, he didn't know it was Gino, but he saw a body on the floor. And the cops estimate that he was there for a good 4 to 5 days before he was found. His body was decomposed enough that initially they couldn't determine a cause of death. It took some time. There was a gun on the floor, although he was not shot. It didn't look like the gun was fired. But he had asked David Manning about getting a gun just before all of this happened because he was so damn paranoid. So there being a gun in the home, he wasn't sure where he got the gun from because he had asked Manning, do you have a gun? And Manning at the time was like, look, I don't have a gun. I can't help you. Well, Gino got a gun somehow. Probably wasn't too tough for him to do given this supposed bad crowd that he was hanging out with. So there was a gun that was found on the floor. They found no sign of drugs in his condo. His mother says, and this is where things really get interesting and kind of creepy. His mother says that shortly after Gino died, she's still in mourning at home. He's not even buried yet. And this man, who identifies himself as a friend of her son, comes to her house one day. And in identifying that he's a friend of her son, she lets him in. And this man tells her not to worry about the funeral expenses. He's going to pay for Gino's funeral. He's going to pay for all the arrangements. And he says, your son owed me a lot of money, but don't worry about the funeral. I'm going to pay for it. And she said she was scared to death. Just by the way he said it, his tone. Oh, your son owed me a lot of money, but don't worry about it. I'm going to pay for his funeral anyway. She said that it just scared the bejeebus out of her. And it's the same man who gave the eulogy, or one of the eulogies, at Gino's funeral. He showed up. He did this whole speech. He was regaling people with stories about them hanging out together and having fun, and nobody knew who this guy was. Bruce Pritchard and all of the wrestling folks said that they had no idea who this person was. It was surreal. Or who any of the other well-dressed, rich-looking people who showed up to this funeral were. Nobody knew. They all just they figured they were drug dealers because they knew what Gino was into. And they saw how well-dressed they were and how they were carrying themselves. And they, I think Pritchard was the one who said he just assumed that they were drug dealers. And they took care of everything. A platinum casket. They're drinking champagne. They're toasting over the casket. They're smashing their champagne glasses over the lid of the casket. There were fans who thought that Chris Adams had murdered him. I mean, this is like you hear the stories of the people who think Kevin Sullivan murdered the Benoit family. He had heat with Benoit, and Benoit stole his wife, Nancy, and it was obviously Kevin Sullivan who had something to do with it. And I feel like half the people who say that are trolling and the other half are actually serious and need to be committed to a mental institution. So you have people like that. And here you had people who thought that Chris Adams murdered him because the two of them were in a bitter feud on television at the time. And Gino had blinded him in an angle on TV, and Chris vowed that he was going to kill him. I mean, literally, he was, on television being carried off by security or police or whoever saying, I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him. And back then, especially down there in that territory at that time, wrestling was real. It's like you hear stories about, like in the South, college football. It's everything, right? It's taken very seriously, and it's a really big deal. And at the time, wrestling, especially in that world-class territory, I feel like maybe that was kind of on the same level with a lot of these people. Like, that's how seriously that people took it and how wildly popular it was. And so people remember that and they say, well, Chris Adams obviously had it out for this guy. He must have had him killed or killed him, or he did something. We should interview him, arrest him. It's his fault. He did it. There are people who believed it. Wrestling was real to a lot of these people back then. It's like when Eddie Gilbert hit Jerry Lawler with his car in the parking lot in Memphis and people called the police on him for it. To a lot of people back then, and frankly, even today to an extent, when wrestling is done right, you can get people to believe. So there was that rumor. Lots of rumors about who killed Gino, if he didn't kill himself, who killed Gino, and how Andre the Giant told people that Gino was shot in the head. He was not shot in the head. That's pretty easily verifiable. He was not shot in the head. Initially, they told his ex-wife, Gino's ex-wife, that it may have been a drug overdose, and the cause of death was listed as acute cocaine intoxication. His mother said that the coroner told her that he had enough cocaine in his system to have killed an elephant. 5 times the amount of cocaine in his system that it would have taken a normal person to OD on. The autopsy report was suspect. It listed him as an uncircumcised male. His ex-wife verified that, in fact, he was circumcised. So there's a little bit of TMI about Gino Hernandez. Now you know. And there were other inconsistencies that listed him as Mexican, even though it wasn't. I mean, you could look at that and say, well, the guy's last name was Hernandez. And so if you have an ME that's just not, doing their job, they'll just think, oh, the guy must be Hispanic or Mexican or whatever. But the whole circumcised, uncircumcised thing, you would think that that's something that they could easily check on. And so I don't know why that would have been listed that way. So there were inconsistencies with the autopsy report that gave people a reason to suspect that maybe, things were either being covered up or maybe things weren't investigated thoroughly enough. Can we really, believe in this determination? Jeannie Clark, Chris Adams' ex-wife, described being over at Gino's house once and watching him take a cereal bowl out of the cabinet full of cocaine. And later in the documentary, David Manning admits that the referee he sent over to check on Gino, when he found him dead and got into the condo, he also saw what he described to Manning as a sugar bowl full of cocaine. He told Manning that he had never seen so much blow in his life. And out of instinct, he dumped it. Or flushed it, or whatever. I assume that means flushed it down the toilet. Whatever he did. Because the cops did not find any drugs when they got to the home. But that would explain why. This was like a thing with wrestlers, I guess, back then. You show up at the scene before the cops do, you flush the drugs. That's always been the rumor about David Von Erich, right? That Bruiser Brody found drugs in his hotel room in Japan and flushed them before the police arrived. I just talked about that last week. This must have been a thing back then. Must have been an unwritten code. But the man who gave the eulogy at Gino's funeral was this guy, John Royal, was his name. And John Royal, when producers contacted him for this documentary, he had just wrapped up serving a 30-year prison term for trafficking cocaine. They played on this special the recorded conversations that they had with John Royal. And on the special, he admits to approaching Gino's mother. He says, I did go to her house and I did approach her and told her I was going to pay for the funeral. He denies saying that Gino, or denies the fact that Gino owed him any money. He's not sure why she would have said that. He denies that part of it. But he also revealed that when he was brought up on those drug charges, he was accused of giving Gino basically bad cocaine. And it may have been that bad cocaine that killed him. Now, he said that was fabricated, even though he was accused of that. He said he never did that it's not true. But it is telling that, I guess, prosecutors, thought that may have been what happened. But anyway, he claims that he was with Gino at a club until 1 a.m. on the night that he presumes that he passed away. He was drinking a lot, Gino was. He assumed that Gino must have been doing drugs as well. He says Gino left with these airline stewardesses, and that was the last time he ever saw him alive. Then they had a recording from a former drug trafficker who came forward with his own version of events. He was anonymous. His voice was, dubbed over. He did not want to be identified. He wanted to remain anonymous. But they talked to him, and they played the recording for Gino's mother. So we see her reaction on camera. She's crying. She says, "My God, it's been 30 years. Just give me a second here. I've been waiting so long." And they put the headphones on her, these noise-canceling headphones, and they play the recording. And this guy on the tape says, "Look, I've got nothing to lose from coming forward now with my story. If Gino's family has been worried for the last 30 years that something might happen to them, they've been worried for 30 years too long." What happened is that he and Gino had, and a bunch of other guys, they got involved in selling drugs. They were drug dealers. They were dealing drugs. And Gino got hooked on the stuff and got way in over his head. And he thinks it was a combination of drinking a lot and then going back to his apartment and doing cocaine that killed him. He just did too much. His body couldn't handle it, and he dropped dead. And so then, and again, that's not absolute end-all, be-all confirmation of anything, but Gino's mother seemed to be relieved hearing that she and her family were, no longer did they have any need to feel. I mean, imagine that, living for 30 years, not knowing, thinking your son was murdered by drug dealers, and if you speak out, they're going to come after you and your kids. Like, what a horrible way to live your life. And that's, as she said, she can't get those 30 years back that she spent being so paranoid and worrying every morning when she would wake up. But she was relieved to hear this and that they had no, reason to feel afraid. And she thanked the producers. She was very thankful to them. And she said that, I feel so good I could go for a margarita right now. I love this lady. She's great. I feel the same. I feel that it was, and look, everybody has their own opinion. None of us know what happened. You could just hear the stories and the facts and, come to your own determination. Just like I'm convinced, as much as they want to make it sound, like David Von Erich had some kind of condition that, he got sick and he died in Japan. I think it was a drug overdose. Can I prove it? No, but that's what I believe happened. In this case, I think it was a drug overdose. I don't think he was murdered. I think it was a drug overdose that killed GINO Hernandez. All the signs point to it. I mean, yes, there are some suspect things, but all the signs point to a drug overdose. And a lot of the paranoia that his family and friends described could probably be attributed to the drugs that he was doing. If he was doing as much of this stuff as they say he was, you know what? I'd be paranoid too. I'd be going out of my mind. I'd be thinking I'm seeing people in the backseat of my car, looking out my window, watching me everywhere I go. The reason he was so freaking paranoid probably had more to do with his drug habit than anything else, than anybody actually being after him. I mean, you had two different people in this documentary describe him keeping a giant bowl of cocaine in his apartment. If you keep a giant bowl of cocaine in your apartment, you may have a drug problem. Although if he was also selling it, then, that may be another reason to keep a lot of cocaine sitting in a giant bowl in your apartment. But, I wouldn't know. So I thought it was a very compelling documentary to watch. Especially the recorded conversations from the drug traffickers and the drug dealers that they played. And his mom, like I said, she's the star of this documentary. She seems like a really sweet lady, and it really sucks that she, for so long, had no real answers and lived in fear. That's just a shame that it was all those years wasted worrying over nothing. The other thing that's revealed, and this was not in the special that made the air on TV. This was sort of like a deleted scene, a bonus scene that got cut, but they did post it online. I saw it on Twitter. It might be on the Viceland YouTube channel as well. I'm not sure. But there's been another rumor about Gino for a number of years. The rumor being that he was actually the son of Paul Bosch, the famous Houston wrestling promoter, who treated Gino like a son and, promoted him and Some people say that, in his younger years, Paul Bosch physically resembled a young Gino Hernandez a lot, and so people thought that he was his illegitimate son. And we now have an answer to that question. So Luis Hernandez was a wrestler. He was Gino's stepfather, which is where he got the Hernandez name from. That is not his birth name. That is not his given name. His birth name was Charles Wolf. Gino's father left before he was even born. And his mother confirms that Charles was his real father, not Paul Bosch, which, again, had been the rumor for decades. As she would know. His mother said, I didn't even know who Paul Bosch was, and I was 16 when I had him. So it could not have been Paul Bosch. It was not Paul Bosch. And she said that Gino's real father reached out to her after he saw the announcement in the paper that he had died, and he saw the name Charles Wolf. Only then did he realize that Gino was his son. When he saw him listed by his real name. The crazy part about it is, not even so much that the father saw the name and called Gino's mother, but he was working as either a police officer or a security guard, a security officer, at the wrestling matches, every Friday night at the arena where Gino would perform. And he would see Gino among all the other wrestlers, but he never put two and two together that was his son. That was his own son. He never knew. And so then once he found out, after the fact, he reached out to Gino's mom. So that's crazy, but there's no longer any debate about that. So I guess there's one question answered, at least, that people can get some closure on as far as who the daddy was. And it was not Paul Bosch. There is one episode left in this season, and it is about the fabulous Moolah. I watched it the other night. I'm not going to give too much away here, but they interview Moolah's daughter, her one daughter, people who stand up for her and want to restore her good name. And also they interview people, including Wendy Richter, who talk about all of the nasty things that Moolah did and the not so nice side of the fabulous Moolah, and how she held women's wrestling back from what it could have been for a good 40 years out of selfishness and greed. So I think on the whole, it covers both sides pretty well. It's not a hit piece on Moolah. It does not come off as a hit piece on her. I think that it's pretty balanced in terms of you get people arguing for her, you get people arguing against her, including some former lady wrestlers who trained with her at her compound that she had, her school, whatever you want to call it. But I am sure this is going to ignite this Moolah controversy all over again. So give it a few days once this thing airs, and you'll see this whole controversy is going to be reignited again, all over again, after what happened last year when they took her name off the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. But it is a very good special, and I sincerely hope, as well as they seem to have done so far, ratings-wise for Viceland, that they will greenlight a season 2. I know the producers have said they already have some ideas. They've already started working on an episode on Dino Bravo. Bring it on. I want more. I thought they did a great job with this series. Even if you're not coming away from every episode feeling like you've learned so many new things, and in some cases I did learn some new things, but just the way they put them together and the way they inform the general audience who probably knows nothing about a lot of these stories, I think is a great thing. And so, yes, I want to see a special on Dino Bravo, and I want to see one they were thinking about doing on Adrian Adonis and his death. I think specials on, Benoit and Owen Hart are probably specials that would be a given in future seasons. And here's one more I'll throw into the pile because I think it would be tailor-made for a special like this, and that is on the death of Nancy Argentino. Just this week, it was 36 years ago this week that Jimmy Snuka murdered his mistress. A lot of questions about that. A lot of questions about a potential payoff. People looking the other way. I sure would love to hear more about that. So there's another idea for a future Viceland special.